A police officer abuses his power mid-flight, thinking no one can stop him. But what he doesn't know, the flight attendant he targets isn't just any crew member. She's the one woman who refuses to back down. What starts as intimidation at 35,000 feet turns into a battle for justice on the ground. And the consequences? Oh, they're far bigger than he ever expected. Stay with us. This story is about to take off. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Renee Caldwell had always loved the hum of an airport, the steady rhythm of rolling luggage, the occasional static-laced announcements, the soft murmurs of travelers moving through terminals. It was a kind of music she had grown used to. She'd been a flight attendant for over a decade, long enough to read people like a book, long enough to know which passengers would be kind and which ones would treat her like part of the furniture. That morning, Houston Liberty International Airport was as busy as ever. Families wrestled with strollers, businessmen typed furiously on their laptops, and clusters of tourists squinted at their boarding passes like they were holding ancient scrolls. Renee moved through it all with practiced ease, a coffee cup in one hand, her tote bag slung over her shoulder. She was scheduled to work the Houston to Newark flight. Nothing special, just another shift in her routine. As she made her way to the crew lounge, she spotted a familiar figure waiting outside the break room. Sophia Ramirez, her closest friend on the job. Sophia had been flying for 5 years, and despite the constant grind of the airline industry, she still had a spark of idealism in her. "You're late," Sophia teased, taking a sip from her own coffee. Renee smirked. "And you're too awake for this hour." Sophia leaned against the counter. "Well, I had to be. I was just watching TSA hold up some poor guy again. You know how they are. Random checks that are never random." Renee glanced toward the security checkpoint. She saw the usual scene, a young black man being pulled aside while others passed by without a second glance. It was a sight she had seen too many times before. She sighed but said nothing. Sophia nudged her. "Come on, tell me you don't feel like saying something." Renee took a slow sip of coffee. "It's not our fight, Sophia. We do our job. We keep our heads down. That's how we get through the day." Sophia rolled her eyes. "Yeah, because staying quiet has changed so much." Renee didn't argue. She had learned the hard way that speaking up could come with consequences. Instead, she glanced at the clock. "Come on, let's check in. Plane won't board itself." As they made their way to the gate, the scent of jet fuel and overpriced airport food filled the air. Another flight, another city, same routine, different day. But this time, something would be different. She just didn't know it yet. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a passenger boarding late. Renee had just finished helping an elderly woman stow her bag when she heard the deep, authoritative voice. "Excuse me," the man said, holding up his boarding pass, with a kind of confidence that suggested he was used to people moving out of his way. Renee turned and took him in immediately. White male, early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who looked like he spent his weekends lecturing people at a country club. His badge was clipped to his belt. Not airport security, not federal agents. Police. She didn't need to read the name to know the type. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He glanced at her name tag. Renee Caldwell. His gaze lingered for a moment too long before he handed over his ticket. "I'm Travis Monroe, Newark PD." Something about the way he said it felt like a challenge. "Well, Officer Monroe, looks like you're in 3B, she said, handing him back his ticket. He smirked. "You said that like you already knew I was trouble." Renee smiled back, though there was no warmth in it. "I've been doing this long enough to know when a passenger's going to be high maintenance." He let out a short laugh, low and knowing. "I like a flight attendant with a sense of humor." She nodded toward his seat. "Enjoy your flight." As Monroe made his way to first class, Renee exhaled slowly. There was something about him that set her on edge. She'd dealt with her fair share of difficult passengers before. Drunks, businessmen who thought they were above the rules, people who treated the crew like their personal servants. But Monroe had a different energy, something quieter, something dangerous. She shook it off and went back to work. A few minutes later, she caught sight of Monroe again, this time engaged in a conversation that was already heading in the wrong direction. He was talking to the man seated next to him, a young Middle Eastern passenger dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, clearly trying to mind his own business. "So, what do you do?" Monroe asked, leaning slightly toward him. The man hesitated. "I work in finance." "Finance, huh? What kind of finance?" Renee immediately recognized the tone. It wasn't curiosity, it was something else. Something accusatory, wrapped up in casual conversation. The passenger cleared his throat. "I specialize in corporate investment." Monroe nodded slowly, then gave a small, amused smile. "You travel a lot?" "Sometimes," the man replied, shifting in his seat. Monroe's smirk widened. "Where to?" "Middle East." "Europe?" Renee felt a tightness in her chest. She knew where this was going. Before the conversation could escalate, she stepped forward, her voice light but firm. "Excuse me, gentlemen. Can I get either of you something to drink?" The passenger in the suit looked relieved for the interruption. "Just water, please." Monroe, however, turned his gaze toward Renee. "No drink for me, but I appreciate the service." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Always good to have someone watching out, right?" Renee held his stare for a beat, then turned back to the passenger. "I'll bring that right over." As she walked back to the galley, she felt Monroe's eyes on her. Not in the way most men looked at her. There was no flirtation there. This was something different, calculating. She had a feeling this flight was going to be longer than she expected. Renee had handled tense situations before. Rowdy passengers, nervous flyers, the occasional entitled businessman who thought no didn't apply to him. But Monroe was a different kind of problem. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't making a scene. He was just watching, calculating. And the way he'd zeroed in on the man next to him, Omar Nasir, according to the manifest, set her on edge. She returned with Omar's water, keeping her expression neutral. "Here you go, sir." Omar took the cup with a small nod of gratitude, but he didn't look relaxed. His shoulders were still stiff, his hands gripping the armrests a little too tightly. Monroe chuckled, stretching his legs out in the extra space first class provided. "You know, Miss Caldwell, I always find it interesting how people get nervous when someone like me asks a few simple questions." Renee didn't bite. "We want all our passengers to be comfortable, Officer Monroe." He gave her that same smug smirk. "Of course, I'm just making conversation. But you'd be surprised how often a little questioning makes people sweat, especially guys like him." Omar inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his cup. Renee saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes darted toward the aisle like he was calculating an escape route. Except there wasn't one. Not at 35,000 feet. "Enough." Renee kept her voice even. "Officer Monroe, if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, let me know. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd let our passengers enjoy their trip in peace." For the first time, Monroe's smirk faltered. Just for a second. Then he leaned back, arms crossed over his chest, the same smug confidence returning. "Relax, Miss Caldwell. No need to get defensive. I just like to know who I'm flying with." His tone was light, casual even, but the message underneath was clear. "I can do whatever I want. And what are you going to do about it?" Renee held his gaze a moment longer, then turned back toward the galley. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She had done just enough to let Monroe know she wasn't going to play along, but not enough to escalate things. Yet. As she reached the galley, Sophia was already waiting, arms crossed. "What the hell was that?" Renee exhaled. "Just a cop who thinks he can interrogate people mid-flight." Sophia's brows knitted together. "We should tell the captain." Renee hesitated. "And say what?" "He hasn't done anything technically wrong yet. Just pushing limits, seeing what he can get away with." Sophia scoffed. "Yeah, well, you and I both know where this is heading. Guys like that, they don't stop." Renee knew she was right. But what could they do? Report him now and risk him turning his badge into a shield, claiming discrimination? Or wait for him to push too far and have no choice but to act? She wasn't sure which was worse. The flight had settled into its usual rhythm. Cabin lights dimmed, passengers flipped through magazines or dozed off, and the quiet hum of the engines filled the air. Renee wanted to believe Monroe had let it go. But then she heard the sharp edge in his voice. I'm going to have to insist, Mr. Nasir. She turned just in time to see Monroe leaning closer to Omar, his posture casual, but his tone anything but. You see, when someone avoids answering a simple question, it makes me wonder what they're hiding. Omar shifted uncomfortably. I told you, I work in finance. Right, but which firm? Who do you work with? Where exactly were you before this flight? That was enough. Renee strode forward, her voice steady but firm. Officer Monroe, I need you to stop harassing our passengers. Monroe leaned back with a dramatic sigh, shaking his head. Harassing? Miss Caldwell, I'm just having a conversation. You're making my passenger uncomfortable, she shot back. Monroe chuckled, shaking his head as if she were being ridiculous. You're awfully sensitive, aren't you? Omar finally found his voice. I'd like to be left alone. Monroe tilted his head, considering. Then with a slow, knowing smile, he leaned back in his seat. Sure. Wouldn't want to make a scene. Renee clenched her jaw. The way he said it, the smirk, the condescension, he was testing her, seeing how far he could push, and she had the sinking feeling that he wasn't done yet. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the galley, breathing through her frustration. Sophia was there, watching. He's baiting you, she said quietly. I know, Renee muttered, but I'm not going to let him get away with it. The question was, how far was he willing to go before she had no choice but to stop him? Renee had seen plenty of difficult passengers in her years working flights, but something about Monroe felt different. He wasn't just testing limits, he was enjoying it. As she moved through the cabin, she felt his eyes follow her. He wasn't watching her the way some men did, sizing her up with lazy interest. No, this was something else, something more like a game. She didn't like games where men like him made the rules. By the time they were halfway through the flight, most of the passengers had settled in. Some napped, others watched movies. The steady drone of the engines filled the space with a kind of stillness. Renee allowed herself a breath. Maybe, just maybe, Monroe would let it go. But then a voice cut through the quiet. Excuse me, Miss Caldwell. Monroe. Renee turned to see him standing in the aisle, towering over a seated Omar. Omar looked visibly exhausted, his fingers gripping his seatbelt. His patience, like hers, was wearing thin. Renee kept her voice level. Is there something I can assist you with, Officer Monroe? Monroe gave her a slow, easy grin. Yeah, I need you to open the overhead bin. Got something up there. Renee glanced at the compartment above him. It was closed, locked the way all bins were in flight. She knew he hadn't put anything up there. She had been there when he boarded, watched him shove his carry-on under his seat like every other passenger. But she also knew what he was doing, making her serve him, making a point. She could feel Sophia watching from the galley, waiting to see how she'd handle it. Renee walked up, unlatched the bin, and pulled it open. What am I looking for? Monroe's smirk widened. Huh. Guess I forgot I checked my bag. My mistake. Renee felt the tightness in her chest, the heat creeping up the back of her neck. He was playing games. She met his eyes. If you need assistance with anything else, officer, let me know. She closed the bin with a controlled click, turned and walked back toward the galley before she said something she'd regret. Sophia followed her, whispering under her breath, That guy's an ass. Yeah, Renee muttered, and he's not done yet. The final hour of the flight had a false kind of peace. Renee could still feel Monroe's presence, but he stayed in his seat, watching. Then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Newark shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. Renee exhaled, relieved. Almost there. Just a little longer. She moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts, reminding passengers to put tray tables up. She had just reached Monroe's row when he suddenly leaned forward. You know, he said, his voice low and conversational, I was thinking, it must be hard for you. Renee paused. Excuse me? Monroe tilted his head. Dealing with all these passengers, keeping your cool? I mean, I've seen it before. Women like you? You get a little power, and suddenly you think you're in charge. Her pulse spiked. Sophia, standing a few rows away, froze. Monroe's smile was slow, taunting. Problem is, you're just here to serve, aren't you? Renee's fingers curled at her sides. She forced herself to breathe. Stay professional. If there's nothing else, Officer Monroe, I suggest you fasten your seatbelt. He grinned like he'd won something. Sure thing, sweetheart. She turned and walked away, her heart hammering. This wasn't just about Omar anymore. Monroe had made it personal. And as the plane began its descent, Renee knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment the plane touched down in Newark, Renee felt a weight lift from her chest, only for it to settle again just as fast. Monroe wasn't done with her. She knew it. Passengers began gathering their belongings, stretching, adjusting their jackets. Some murmured about connections and layovers. Monroe, however, remained seated, arms crossed, watching as Renee moved through the cabin. She didn't acknowledge him. She was halfway through reminding a woman to check her seat pocket when she heard it. Excuse me, Miss Caldwell. Her breath caught, but she turned composed. Yes, Officer Monroe. He stretched, slow and deliberate. I'd like to speak to your supervisor. Her stomach dipped. Sophia, who had been standing by the exit door, stiffened. Renee didn't react. Is there an issue? Monroe smiled like they were old friends. Oh, I think there might be. A little concern about professionalism. I'd hate to think someone like you was treating passengers unfairly. The words hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Passengers were still gathering their things, but some had gone quiet, their ears subtly tuned in. Omar, a few rows down, froze in his seat, watching with cautious eyes. Renee refused to let him rattle her. I'd be happy to direct you to customer relations, she said evenly. You can file a formal complaint through the airline's process. Monroe's smirk widened. Oh, I plan to... He stared her down for another second before finally standing, grabbing his carry-on from under the seat. Then he turned, walking toward the exit as if nothing had happened. Sophia rushed to Renee's side the moment he was out of earshot. He's setting you up, she whispered. I know, Renee muttered. And the worst part? It would probably work. By the time Renee finished post-flight duties, she already had an uneasy feeling in her gut. Monroe's words lingered, his smug confidence a sign that he had already decided how this would play out. As she stepped off the jet bridge, she was met by Karen Holt, the airline's supervisor for in-flight operations. Holt wasn't the kind of woman who softened things. Late 50s, sharp-eyed, all about keeping the airline's name clean. She held a tablet in one hand, her expression unreadable. Caldwell, she said. My office. Now. Sophia shot Renee a worried glance, but there was nothing either of them could do. Renee followed Holt through the terminal, past bustling passengers and uniformed crew, into a small, windowless office. The door clicked shut behind them. Holt set the tablet down. We received a complaint about you from a first-class passenger, Officer Travis Monroe. Renee had been expecting it, but still, hearing it out loud made her jaw clench. He claimed, Holt continued, flipping through notes, that you were openly hostile toward him, that you singled him out and undermined his authority while he was merely ensuring safety on board. Renee let out a slow breath. He's twisting it, she said. He was harassing a passenger, and I did my job, de-escalated the situation. Holt's expression remained unreadable. Did he threaten you directly? Renee hesitated. Not exactly. Not in a way she could prove. He made sure I knew he could make things difficult, she admitted. Holt exhaled sharply, tapping her nails against the desk. This puts us in a difficult position, she said. He's law enforcement. Your crew. And if this gets blown up into a bigger issue... She didn't have to finish. Renee already knew how these things played out. The airline wouldn't want controversy, wouldn't want to fight with a police officer. They'd find an easy way to sweep it under the rug. Renee refused to let that happen. You have other passengers who can confirm what really happened, she said, voice firm. You have my crew backing me up. Holt studied her, then sighed. We'll review it internally. The words sounded like a dismissal. Renee understood the message loud and clear. Don't make this worse. Don't make waves. But as she walked out of that office, her stomach tight with frustration, she knew one thing for sure. Monroe wasn't just trying to ruin her job. He was trying to put her in her place, and she wasn't going to let him win. Renee walked out of Holt's office with her fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The fluorescent lights of the terminal felt too bright, the air too heavy. Monroe had played his move, and the worst part? It was working. She barely had time to process before she spotted Sophia waiting just outside the crew lounge. The moment their eyes met, Sophia pushed off the wall, crossing her arms. "How bad?" she asked. Renee let out a slow breath. "Internal review," Sophia scoffed, "which means they'll pretend to investigate, then tell you to let it go for the sake of avoiding a PR mess." Renee didn't argue, because Sophia was right. "You need to fight this," Sophia said. "You have witnesses. You have me." Renee ran a hand over her face, exhaustion creeping in. "Even if I push back, what happens? Best case, they quietly side with me, but that guy still walks away with his badge, free to do it again to someone else." Sophia exhaled, rubbing her temples. "So what? We let him win?" Renee thought about Monroe's smug expression, the way he knew exactly how the system would work in his favor. "I don't plan on letting him win," she said. "I just need to be smart about how I fight back." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking?" Renee hesitated, but only for a second. "I need more than just a witness statement," she said. "I need proof." Sophia blinked. "You mean, like, video?" Renee nodded. "From who?" And that was the problem. The only one she knew had seen it all was Omar Nasir, the passenger Monroe had been harassing in the first place, which meant she needed to find him. Tracking down a passenger after a flight wasn't easy, but it also wasn't impossible. Renee knew his name, Omar Nasir. She'd seen it on the manifest. First-class seat, booked through a corporate account, finance. That gave her something to work with. The next morning, after a restless night filled with racing thoughts, she sat in a coffee shop near her apartment, laptop open, scrolling through LinkedIn profiles. And there he was. Omar Nasir, senior investment consultant, based in New York. She hesitated before typing out a message. "Mr. Nasir, I don't mean to intrude, but I was the flight attendant on your recent Houston to Newark trip. I believe you're aware of the situation involving Officer Monroe. I'd appreciate the chance to speak with you." She stared at the screen, debating whether to hit send. What if he didn't want to get involved? What if Monroe had already intimidated him into staying quiet? But then she thought about what was at stake, not just for her, but for anyone else Monroe would target next. She clicked send, and then she waited. Hours passed with nothing. She checked her phone obsessively, refreshing the page as if that would somehow make him respond faster. Then, just after noon, a notification popped up. "Omar Nasir has replied to your message." She clicked it immediately. "Ms. Caldwell, I was hoping you'd reach out. I saw what happened, and I want to help." Relief flooded through her. For the first time since Monroe had set his sights on her, Renee felt like she had a real chance to fight back. Renee sat at a corner table in a quiet cafe, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She had been early, needing time to settle herself before Omar arrived. She didn't have to wait long. Omar Nasir walked in, scanning the room briefly before spotting her. He looked the same as he had on the flight. Sharp suit, composed expression. But there was something new in his eyes. Determination. He slid into the chair across from her. "Ms. Caldwell." "Renee," she corrected, offering a small smile. "Omar," he returned. There was a pause. The unspoken weight of everything that had happened hung between them. "I appreciate you meeting me," Renee said. Omar exhaled. "Honestly, I was hoping I'd hear from you." That caught her off guard. "You were?" He nodded. "After what happened on that flight, I had a feeling it wouldn't end there, and then I saw your airline was reviewing a complaint against you." Renee frowned. "How do you know that?" "I have connections in the industry," he said simply. "Word travels." That was concerning, but also useful. "I assume Monroe hasn't reached out to you?" Renee asked. "Number. But men like him don't need to. They let the system do the work for them." That was exactly what Renee was afraid of. She took a breath. "I need your help, Omar. I need someone to back me up. Officially. The airline won't take my word over a police officer's unless I have a credible witness. Omar didn't hesitate. I'll do it. Renee blinked. Just like that. He leaned forward slightly, voice quieter. Ms. Renee, I've dealt with men like Monroe before, not just as a passenger on a flight, but in everyday life. I know what it's like to be questioned, to be treated like a suspect just because of who I am. That man wasn't just trying to intimidate me. He wanted me to feel powerless. But I refused to let that stand. Renee felt a rush of gratitude. There's one more thing, Omar said, glancing around as if ensuring they weren't being overheard. I wasn't the only one watching that day. Renee's pulse ticked up. What do you mean? Omar reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward her. And there it was. A video. A recording of Monroe, leaning in too close, his voice laced with condescension. The smug smirk on his face as he tested both Renee and Omar. It wasn't long, but it was enough. Enough to show the power play. Enough to prove Monroe wasn't just having a casual conversation. Renee's breath hitched. You recorded this? Omar nodded. I didn't plan to, but when he started pressing me, I knew I needed something. Just in case. Renee's fingers tightened around her cup. This changed everything. With Omar's video, Renee had something she hadn't had before. Leverage. But she also knew it wouldn't be that simple. Monroe wasn't the kind of man to back down. He was the kind of man who dug in deeper, fought dirtier. So she had to be smart. After leaving the cafe, Renee immediately called Sophia. You have a recording? Sophia nearly yelled through the phone. Yes, Renee said, walking briskly down the sidewalk. And Omar is willing to give a statement, but I need to be careful. Sophia's tone darkened. Renee, you know what happens when guys like him feel cornered. I do, Renee admitted, but if I don't push back now, he wins. A pause, then softer. What's the plan? Renee exhaled. First, I need to send this to someone who can actually use it. Sophia hesitated. You mean the press? Renee hadn't been sure at first, but the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. If she kept this quiet, Monroe's connections within the system could bury it. If she brought it into the light, she'd have a chance to tip the scales. She had to take the risk. I know a journalist, she said. Someone who covers misconduct cases. If I get this in front of her, Monroe won't be able to make it disappear. Sophia let out a breath. You're really doing this, huh? Renee set her jaw. Yeah, I am. She had been pushed around long enough. It was time to push back. Renee sat in her car outside a small newsroom in downtown Newark, gripping her phone tightly. The email was already typed out. The video file was attached. All she had to do was hit send. Her contact, Lisa Tran, was a journalist who had built a career exposing abuses of power, especially within law enforcement. If there was anyone who could make sure Monroe's actions wouldn't be swept under the rug, it was her. Still, hesitation gnawed at her. Once this was out there was no taking it back. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and pressed send. The message was gone. The fight had officially begun. 2 days later, the headline appeared. Newark PD officer accused of harassment on flight. Video raises questions about misuse of authority. Lisa had done her job well. The article was sharp, clear, and damning. It detailed Monroe's behavior, the complaint against Renee, and, most importantly, it included the video. Within hours, the story exploded online. Comments poured in. Some people sided with Renee, outraged at Monroe's abuse of power. Others defended him, calling it a misunderstanding or an attack on law enforcement. But the airline? They had no choice but to respond. That afternoon, Renee got a call from Karen Holt. You started a media firestorm, Caldwell, Holt said, her voice tight. Renee didn't apologize. So, what's the airline going to do about it? There was a pause, then Holt sighed. The complaint against you is being reconsidered. Renee's heart pounded. You're saying I won't be fired? I'm saying, Holt said carefully, that the company doesn't want to be on the wrong side of this mess. It wasn't exactly justice, but it was a start. Renee had expected Monroe to fight back. What she hadn't expected was how quickly he would start losing control. By the end of the week, a formal investigation had been opened against him by Newark PD. The department was now facing scrutiny, not just for Monroe's behavior on the flight, but for past complaints against him that had been ignored. And Monroe? He was furious. Renee learned just how angry he was when she walked out of her apartment one evening and saw him leaning against his car, waiting for her. Her pulse spiked, but she didn't stop moving. "Long week, Miss Caldwell?" Monroe said, his voice mockingly casual. She didn't respond. She just kept walking. He pushed off the car, falling into step beside her. Funny how fast things spiral when people don't know their place. Renee stopped and turned. "Are you threatening me, Officer Monroe?" Monroe smiled, but his eyes were sharp, dangerous. "Just making an observation." She held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "If you're here to intimidate me," she said, "it's not going to work." Monroe tilted his head. "You sure about that?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then sirens wailed in the distance. Monroe's jaw tensed, just for a second, before he let out a slow breath. "Careful, Miss Caldwell," he murmured. "Some fights aren't worth winning." And then he walked away. Renee stood frozen, watching him go. She knew deep in her gut that he wasn't done yet, but neither was she. The next morning, Renee woke to her phone buzzing with multiple notifications. She groggily reached for it, expecting another round of social media debates over the article. Instead, she found something else. Breaking news. Newark PD places Officer Travis Monroe on administrative leave, pending investigation. She sat up fast, rereading the words to make sure she wasn't imagining them. The department was finally acting. She quickly dialed Sophia. "You saw it?" Sophia answered immediately. "Saw it? I almost threw my phone across the room," Renee said, swinging her legs off the bed. "They're actually suspending him." "For now," Sophia cautioned, "but they haven't charged him yet." Renee knew that. But this was progress. Monroe had spent years bullying people, knowing the system would protect him. Now, for the first time, the system was pushing back. She scrolled through the article. The police department's official statement was vague. Typical PR language about investigating allegations seriously. But the real blow came from the public response. People were coming forward. In the comments section, former passengers, Newark residents, and even a few anonymous sources from within the department were sharing their own encounters with Monroe. It wasn't just about her anymore. Monroe's entire pattern of misconduct was coming to light, and he had to know it. Later that evening, Renee was locking up after a late shift when her phone rang. She frowned at the unknown number, debating whether to answer. Then instinct kicked in. She swiped to accept. "Hello?" Silence. Then a low, familiar voice. "You think this is over?" Her blood went cold. "Monroe," she said, voice steady. He exhaled a sharp breath. "You really think they're going to take your word over mine?" "They're not just taking my word," she said. "They're looking at the evidence, at your history." A pause, then his tone darkened. "You have no idea what you started." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to show fear. "Go to hell, Monroe," she said calmly. And then she hung up. Her hands were shaking. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. He was losing control, and he knew it. 3 weeks later, Monroe was formally terminated from the Newark Police Department. The decision came after an internal review, which not only confirmed his behavior on the flight, but uncovered years of complaints that had been buried. The department tried to frame it as accountability, but the truth? They only acted because they had no other choice. Renee read the news in her apartment, her coffee cooling beside her. Sophia texted her just minutes after the article went live. "He's done. You did it." Renee smiled, but she knew this wasn't just about her. Monroe had hurt so many people. She was just the one who finally forced the system to listen. She stared out the window, letting the moment settle in. Then her phone rang. Lisa Tran. "Renee," Lisa said the moment she answered. "There's something you should know." Renee's heart skipped. "What?" Lisa exhaled. "Monroe might be out of the force, but he's not out of moves. I have sources saying he's lawyering up. He might be looking for a way to sue, retaliate." Renee wasn't surprised. Men like Monroe, they never just accepted consequences. But she wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that flight weeks ago. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She took a slow breath. "Let him try." because now she was ready for whatever came next. Power unchecked is power abused. Travis Monroe believed his badge made him untouchable, that he could intimidate and manipulate without consequence. But what he didn't count on? A flight attendant who refused to be silenced. Renee's story isn't just about standing up for herself, it's about holding those in power accountable, even when the system is built to protect them. So now we ask you, have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? What would you have done in Renee's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, where the underdog fights back and justice finds a way, hit that subscribe button. Because trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.